Thank you for joining us this evening for the Archive Evening webinar. I would like to hand over to the Master who will introduce the evening.
Welcome to all of you from intermittently sunny Berwick-upon-Tweed. Very good evening and warm welcome to this, I think, our first ever online archive evening. It's a great delight for me to be able to say that this is actually my first engagement as your master. And having said that, and having taken part in these before, and indeed even co-organised one of the archive evenings, this is for me always one of the highlights of the stationer's year. And the image that always floats through my mind on these occasions is that of George Tokefield with his wheelbarrow, surrounded by the fiercely encroaching flames of the Great Fire of London. There he was, ardently determined to save for all time the remarkable early archive of the Worshipful Company of Stationers, as it was then named. Our archive is one of the jewels in our crown, including early Shakespeare folios and other similar riches. And now that it's digitised, it is also helping to fund the company in its charitable and educational work. Maybe this evening will itself form part of our living archive, for this is clearly a historic moment. It is the first virtual archive evening, as I said, offered by stationers. And as throughout our history, we've been innovators in each of our industries, publishing, printing, journalism, stationery, so we're doing the same thing here tonight. Now, Gordon Johnson will be presenting and coordinating this evening, and I shall not steal his thunder by telling you what's in store or who will address you. I'll leave that all to him. Suffice to say that it's a further delight for me that we are on the same billboard together, so to speak. We are established friends through Robert Baines. I always avoid the word we're old friends because that's depressing for both of us. But we were established friends through Robert Baines, who was both Gordon's and my headmaster, albeit at different schools. And Robert was effectively the last long-standing head of Stationers' Company's School, of which I'm an alumnus. Robert was also latterly a liveryman of the company. Not only was Robert Gordon's headmaster at Richmond School in Yorkshire, but owing to the premature death of Gordon's parents, Robert and his wife were wards for Gordon. Doubtless his life as a historian was partly inspired by Robert, who himself taught history. Gordon's career is more than distinguished. For 17 years, president of Wolfson College, Cambridge, he was also a syndic, effectively a director, of Cambridge University Press, and he chaired that body for some 16 years. We are very fortunate indeed that he is a stationer, and even more fortunate tonight to have him as our shepherd and guide through what I know will be a fascinating evening. Over to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Master, for that very kind introduction and for hosting this year's archive evening. It is, as you've mentioned, a stationer's tradition to move with the times, to innovate and to lead change. Tonight is no exception. Prevented from meeting in the hall with wine and, as the deputy clerk so felicitously phrases it, a substantial buffet, we are embracing digital technology and working from home. You can participate by writing in questions as we go. Check out the bar on the bottom of your screen and write in where it says Q&A. If your question is directed at a particular speaker, please indicate. This evening, we're looking at the daily life of the Stationers' Company. Broadly defined nowadays as a concern for the communications and contents industries, the company has all along been an organization to develop and protect jobs and investment in a web of creative activities requiring some structure to ensure their harmonious working. The company has served over centuries to manage complex interactions between different skills and businesses, and has played a vital role in navigating an ever-shifting regulatory environment, locally in London and nationally established by the Crown and Parliament. But the company could not have functioned had it not become something much more than a mouthpiece for economic interests. It had to develop a human personality and become a truly social and cultural being. It brought diverse men and women together to get to know each other, to become friends, and to enjoy each other's company. This is achieved on two fronts. First, the creation of a community in which people were admitted on the basis of commonly held criteria, with an established hierarchy and appropriate rituals at each stage, marking the privilege and responsibilities of membership. Second, a public display of communal identity to be recognized by society at large. Belonging follows a similar pattern of admission and rising seniority to those of the ancient universities or through the ecclesiastical hierarchies. A sequence of tests and accompanying rituals, from apprentice to freeman, liveryman, court assistant to master, some of which we witnessed only last week in the declarations of the incoming wardens and the installation of you, Master, to preside over us for the coming year. These are then cemented by celebrations, usually in the form of eating and drinking, some of which are open to guests to let them know what we are about. This creation of community carries with it quite wide responsibilities. An interest in recruitment, always from the earliest times, in part directed through targeted educational opportunities at the talented young outsider, and always ready to welcome the skilled foreigner, all backed by pastoral care, support for new entrants to the industries with advice and perhaps investment, loans and grants to members in hardship, pensions for widows and orphans. We'll see something of all this in the presentations tonight. In putting flesh and blood on the daily life of the company, our speakers look at these fascinating issues from different perspectives and at different times. But in all of them, you will recognize the essential spirit of the company today. Our first speaker is Karen Waring. She is writing a PhD thesis at Bath Spa University, guided by Professor Ian Gadd. She is studying the registers in our archive, covering the period 1557 to 1637. These records do more than simply list publications. Used in context and with other archival material, they shed light on manufacturing processes, on the ownership of rights in printing and publication, and in the ways the company recruited members and how they rose through its ranks. Karen.
From its very inception, the concept and language of community has been an integral feature of the Stationers' Company's identity. It was founded initially in 1403 to act as a trade body for the benefit, welfare and protection of the various crafts and trades associated with book production in London. It took a few years before it became more commonly known as the Stationers' Company, and the various manifestations of its name before its incorporation often reflected the brotherly bonds of a membership with shared interests and concerns. The Charter of Incorporation contains a phrase that can be translated as community of stationers, and the recurrent emphasis placed upon this implies that it was an important principle for the company. Whilst the process of incorporation was primarily concerned with the company's business and status within London civic society, the language of the Charter placed the community and its welfare very much at its heart, and it suggests that the company was conscious of its responsibilities being far more profound than just the business of being a trade body. Although the attention paid to the commercial and cultural aspects of the company's records, and in particular the registers, is crucial to informing our knowledge and understanding of the London book trade, looking beyond the transactional accounts, there is a wealth of material here in the Stationers' Company's archive which sheds light upon its social engagements and obligations. For example, the Wardens' accounts record the company's presence and involvement in the family occasions of its members, so you can find entries for the occupying of the hall for the weddings of their children and kin, and the hiring of the company's hearse cloth for funerals. But they also showed that the company had a role in the organisation of such events, as is evidenced by Simon Coston's funeral in 1564, whereby they received a mistress Coston when her husband was buried the sum of 6 shillings 8pence, whereof there was spent at the castle in Paternoster Row 4 shillings 10pence. And these illustrate how closely connected the domestic and corporate ideas of community and family were. In documenting the significant personal and professional moments within a stationer's life, the company's records for this period provide us with a valuable insight into the role it played in the daily lives and routines of its members and their families. This evening I shall be discussing some of the pathways that were available for people to become members of this community and the opportunities that they had to advance through its corporate structure. The experiences, as the company recorded them, of Abel Jeffs and Thomas Dawson as they progressed in their own very different ways through their careers, illustrates the value that the company placed upon the social implications of its charter and how it discharged its responsibilities with regards to the welfare of this community. It's fair to say that Thomas Dawson's career had an auspicious start. The accounts for the year 1559-60 record that the company received a master jug for presenting of Thomas Dawson for to be his apprentice for 8 years from the Feast of St. Bartholomew, anno 1559, and paid for his presentment 6pence. Most members entered into this community of stationers by putting themselves as apprentices, and in doing so they were contractually bound for an agreed number of years to a master, who would then instruct them into the art or mystery of the trade in return for their service. This entry shows us that Dawson was indentured to the printer Richard Jugg, who was a senior figure within the company. Dawson had placed himself with a master who was a long-term practitioner of the trade and who'd achieved a good degree of authority and respect over the course of his career, and perhaps more importantly, Jugg knew well the workings of the company. So we can see that Dawson was suitably placed to learn his craft from a particularly privileged perspective. The Wardens' accounts reveal a great deal of variation in the terms of apprenticeship bindings, and that they could range anywhere between 7 and 12 years in duration, but it would appear that the average length of service for stationers' apprentices was 7 years, and the terms usually reflected the age at which majority was reached, and Dawson's terms would suggest that he would have been 16 years of age at the time of his binding. Unfortunately, there's a gap in the company's archives for the years 1571 to 76, and it's during this period that Abel Jeffs came to the company. The details concerning his apprenticeship binding can only be inferred from his freedom record. The register records that Jeffs was indentured to Henry Beineman and that he obtained his freedom on the 26th of February 1580. Allowing for the average length of apprenticeship, it would suggest that Jeffs's binding and presentation would have featured in the accounts for the year 1572 to 73. Jeffs's master, Henry Beineman, was an incredibly active stationer, as can be seen by the number of texts he entered in the registers and the many acknowledgements of his role in printing copies for other members. Ronald McCarrow makes a point of noting that so largely did his business increase that in 1572 he had a bookseller's shop or shed in St. Paul's churchyard, known as the Three Wells, in addition to his printing house. And this could well indicate the type of service undertaken by Jeffs, which would seem to be confirmed by his career as a bookseller printer, but it also implies that he would have received particularly intensive training. Both Dawson and Jeffs achieved their freedoms through servitude, by which they served out the full term of their contracted service, As we can see from the record of Dawson's freedom on the 18th of February 1568, the date confirms that he did indeed serve the entirety of his 8-year indenture, and likewise with Jeff's. Whilst records of his apprenticeship binding are sadly lost, the dating of his freedom record would suggest that he also completed the full term of his service. There were several ways besides servitude to become a member of the company. Obtaining freedom by patrimony was one such way, and apprentices choosing this option were able to take advantage of parental affiliations and gain their freedom. Although it was expected that an apprentice should have reached the age of majority, being 24 years of age, upon completion of service, the patrimonial route allowed freedom to occur at an earlier age. Membership of the company could also be achieved by redemption, and this method involved the payment of a fee to secure freedom, which was usually set at a higher rate than other forms of freedom. But it was also possible to join the company through translation, which involved transferring the freedom that was obtained from one company to that of another. This was particularly useful for members who'd taken the patrimonial route, but who practised trades which were different to the company they had been admitted to. Another option was to be admitted to the Brethren. The Brethren, or the Brothers, was a pathway for people who were aliens, strangers or foreigners, and for the members of other livery companies who practised trades that were regulated by the Stationers' Company. And Edward Arber remarked that it was admission for those who were beyond the liberties of the city. In 1560, the Stationers' Company was permitted the use and wear of a livery by the Court of Aldermen. It was a significant event for the company, as this entitled its liveried members to vote in city elections and to actively participate in civic governance. The record of this decision in the Wardens' accounts would appear to suggest that this was considered to be a restoration of old rights, and that the livery was new begun and revived again in the colours of scarlet and brown blue. However, the lack of records confirming whether the company had previously been awarded this status, let alone had the honour removed, has led to suggestions that the company had founded or belonged to the fraternity of St. John the Evangelist before 1507. Whilst this didn't have full civic entitlements, its representatives were permitted to appear on public occasions in the livery or clothing of this fraternity. The financial costs of being admitted to the livery meant that it was a career pathway that was generally followed by the wealthier members of the company. Approximately only 1 in 6 members ever progressed to this level. And since obtaining his freedom, Thomas Dawson had formed a partnership and established a business with Thomas Gardner, and had taken on the service of 5 apprentices between 1576 and 1584, which would imply that Dawson's business was indeed successful. The records note that Abel Jeffs entered his first title on August 28, 1584, and this was also the year in which he started his first known workshop. This activity suggests that Jeffs had been employed as a journeyman printer in the 4 years that followed his freedom. The contrast between Dawson and Jeffs at similar points in their careers demonstrates the choices that face new freemen. You either earned your living as a journeyman in the service of other members, or you founded your own business as a master. Dawson paid the sum of 20 shillings to be admitted to the livery on the 6th of May 1585, and by doing so he gained his civic entitlements and the right to wear the clothing, but he also became eligible for election to serve as an official within the company. Abel Jeffs, however, was not admitted to the livery, and the figures bear out that this was a far more typical experience for stationers. It may well suggest his business was in a far more precarious state than that of Dawson's, and that financial uncertainties ensured he was unable to pursue this course of action. By remaining a member of the yeomanry, Jeffs would have been ineligible for election to office. In order to serve the company in an official position, a member had to be elected. The accounts for the first election of the Master and Wardens in 1557 illustrate that these were social occasions. Dinners were usually part of the proceedings and were important for promoting communal spirit amongst members on what could potentially be a fractious occasion. In 1591-92, Thomas Dawson was elected to serve as a renter warden, and he would have been charged with collecting the quarterages and rents due to the company. And as a side note, funding of the livery dinners held on Lord Mayor's Day were also part of their remit. Dawson's progression through the company's ranks was flawless, and this is perhaps one reason why he is often regarded as being the ideal companyman. He served as an under warden in 1595-6, he was elected to serve as an upper warden in 1600, and again in 1603, and he became master in 1609, an office he held once more in 1615. Dawson's career demonstrates the quintessential progression through the company's structure. It doesn't seem to have been an overly aggressive rise through the ranks, and he obviously maintained some focus upon sustaining the success of his business. By holding office, he would have been eligible for appointment as an assistant once the term of service was done, and indeed Dawson was chosen on the 12th of May 1594. With this, he became a member of the Court of Assistants, and consequently was able to participate in the process for making executive decisions concerning the company and its members. Gregg and Boswell note that an important and amiable function of the court was the granting or administration of charity, and an entry in the Wardens' accounts for 1564-65 records that Thomas Settles was granted 6 shillings 8 at the time of his need when he was hurt, and this page also notes the relief made to William Harold and widow Apley. These entries mark the start of a more conscious effort to document the company's charitable awards and suggest how the community understood the company's duty of care and how they expected it to discharge this responsibility. Bequests made to the company were an important source of income for its charitable activities, but there were other ways in which individuals and the company collaborated to contribute to the welfare of the community. On the 1st of March 1596, Dawson entered a number of titles, although the entry was subsequently struck through. A note in the margin states that although one of the titles was undoubtedly Richard Watkins's copy, Dawson could print the other titles if no right was exercised for the use of the company who would lay on the materials, and 6p in every pound from this venture would go towards poor relief. The records revealed that in 1592 Dawson, in his capacity as renter, had cause to deal with Jeffs. It was part of Dawson's duty to conduct searches to seize property and goods that contravened the company's ordinances and decrees, and in July a search of Jeffs's premises was organised because he had contemptuously proceeded in printing a book without authority. Jeffs made regular appearances before the court over the course of his career, but on this occasion Jeffs had resisted the search, using violence to our officer, which forced the court to commit him to ward. On the 18th of December 1592, Jeffs made another appearance, according to the direction of the Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, whereby he humbly acknowledged his former offences and undutifulness, craving pardon and favour for the same, and promising hereafter to live as becometh an honest man, and to show himself obedient and dutiful in the company and to the ordinances thereof. And without giving away too much of a spoiler here, this submission by Jeffs was perhaps not as enduring as it should have been. In the Warden's accounts there are signs as to the precariousness of Jeff's business, and they record the occasions when he had to approach the company for financial assistance. In March 1593, Jeff surrendered 200 books of London's Complaint as his pawn to the company in return for the loan of 10 shillings. On the 12th of October, the company loaned him a further sum of £2 and 7 shillings in return for 3 reams of catechisms. And it's clear to see that 1592-93 was a difficult year for Jeffs, and a possible explanation can be conjectured from an entry below this second loan. The company gave a payment of 5 shillings to Abel Jeffs's wife for her relief when her house was visited, and the language would seem to indicate that the Jeffs household had been significantly affected by plague in this year. In 1595, Jeffs printed Giovanni Cipriano's The Most Strange and Wonderful Prophecy, and this lewd book and diverse other lewd ballads led to the seizure of his press, which was transported and destroyed at the Hall at some cost to the company, and he was committed to ward again. Although he was imprisoned at the company's behest, he petitioned for charitable relief on the 1st of March 1595, which was successful, and he was awarded 2 shillings. That this was the company's response shows the strength of the community's fraternal bonds. However errant a member was, they were still part of that family, and it would take an exceptional effort to be excluded from the stationers' community. Jeffs and Dawson's experiences illustrate just how greatly the company valued its social responsibilities, and also how important that sense of communal identity was for its members, whether it was achieved by progressing through the corporate ranks or just by having the knowledge that at the times of most need you were able to call upon that community for relief.
Thank you very much, Karen. Very illuminating. We have a couple of questions which we may as well take now. One is in the nature of a sort of a planted question, which is, could you say a little more about the Brethren? And is it the case that admission to the company by this route declined in importance during the period that you're studying?
I think that for the period that I research, it's an active pathway into the company, but you know, it comes in and out of favour according to social situations. Obviously, when there are, you know, times when you need to swell membership, it's incredibly useful. And I think, you know, it's still a distinct category from the freemen, as late as in 1684 in the Charter of the 22nd of May. There, it's still a distinct category, but I think it kind of fades from significance.
In that period.
Not too long after that, Brethren tends to take another meaning, meaning the brotherhood of the membership as a whole, rather than being two distinct categories of
okay. Thank you. So could you now deal with Alison Strachan's question about, were there many bookbinding apprentices in the period of your study?
Yes, there are quite a number. I think I certainly come across quite a few that have been turned over to bookbinders for a portion of their service. So they're taken on by printers, and then an additional clause they are put across to bookbinders to serve actually most of the term of service. So basically, they from their final year really is only with the printer that they're bound to.
Okay.
So there's a lot of incidences happening.
And can you shed any light on Carol Tullo's question about why there's a gap in the registers between 1571 and 1676?
Yes, this is often attributed to the company's appointment of an official paid clerk for the first time. George Whipple is the first clerk appointed in 1571. And there is it kind of instigates a reorganisation of the administrative structure, and
So after 1576, I mean, it's much more professional.
Yes.
Is that the end?
Yeah. We get Richard Collins, who succeeds Whipple, and is one of the longest lasting clerks that the company has. He comes in 75 and starts to reorganise again, and and actually it starts to become a more professional record of the company's activities.
Okay. So now Paul Wilson's noting that there was a significant translation of members from the Drapers Company in 1603, and if I remember rightly, I mean, Caxton was a draper, wasn't he? I think. But Paul's question is, was this the last such translation of any significance?
I don't know. It's one of those things where they happen kind of quite far apart. So that it still happens, but that there's no mass translation from companies. But sometimes, if you want to be involved in the book trade, it really helps if you do translate to the become one of the stationers' company.
I see that Mark Bland has, if you click on the chat thing, Mark Bland has made a very helpful comment, probably correcting me about Caxton, but also I think saying that there's movement from grocers and so on. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Let's move on now. Our next speaker is Margaret Wills. After a distinguished career as publisher for the National Trust, Margaret has turned to writing books. She'll tell us more about this shift in her life from, as she puts it, gamekeeper to poacher in a talk on the 10th of September. Her first book is the lovely Reading Matters, which is about books and libraries, published in 2008. Since then, there have been a stream of books, mainly from Yale University Press and the Bodleian Library, about literature, botanical and horticultural matters, and friendships. She's currently working on a book about St. Paul's Churchyard, a place that's been absolutely central to the company's life and times. Margaret.
The members of the Stationers' Company had to work particularly hard after the Great Fire to recover their businesses. But it was not all hard work. There were plenty of opportunities for fun, just as there are in the company today when not prevented by a pandemic. Feasts were held throughout the year. The celebration of the company's patron saint, St. John the Evangelist, was marked by a dinner in the hall on the 6th of May. Another, from 1684, was a feast in November in celebration of St. Cecilia, the patron saint of music. This apparently began with John Blow's "Welcome every guest, welcome to our music's feast." Within 20 years, the music's feast was stopped because it had become too lively an affair. In between these two celebrations came the election or election feast, following the choosing of a new master, which by the 17th century took place in August. This, as far as the trade was concerned, was a dead time of the year, when booksellers and printers could take breath before preparing for the return of the royal court, the courts of justice, and aristocrats from their country estates, all important customers. An invitation to the dinner for the 10th of August 1681 gives an idea of the proceedings. The stationers were to meet at 9 in the morning and, gowned and hooded, process to St. Martin within Ludgate to hear a sermon before dining in the hall. Failure to bring hood and gown result in a fine of 2 shillings, a goodly sum. Such fines would go to a fund for poor stationers, a reminder of the company's social concerns. Dinner in the 17th century was usually taken at noon. Interestingly, the Beadle also invited wives to dine, and a bill of 1686 in the archives for printing specifies 100 tickets for the livery feast, plus 30 for court assistants and their wives. The archives are rich in documents which give us the background to these August feasts. A bill for 1677 lists some of the food. The key element was venison, supplied by the renter Wardens. This bill shows 2 bucks. They were roasted, well larded with bacon along with turkeys. A half of a deer was to go into pasties. An early 17th century recipe for such pasties recommended parboiling the meat in a liquor flavoured with herbs such as rosemary and fennel, then marinading in vinegar for 12 hours. It was then put in a coffin of pastry with sweet butter and spices and baked for a further 12 hours. The bill also mentions umble pies. Umbles were the entrails of the deer. Although we talk of eating humble pie as an act of contrition, recipes of the period suggest quite a rich dish. One talks of mincing the umbles finely, adding cinnamon and ginger and sugar, dates and currants and chopped almonds. These were all baked with fat and again put in a coffin. Meat dominates the list, but there is a reference to vegetables. Savoy sprouts, a forerunner of Brussels sprouts, cabbage, artichokes, and French beans. The artichokes were of the globe variety, very fashionable in the 17th century. A contemporary recipe advised cutting off the tops and then boiling them with spices before baking with a little vinegar and butter. Sugar was scraped onto them before serving. All the dishes would have been placed on the table at the same time, similar to the way Chinese meals are served today. Oranges and lemons are also listed, but they would seem to have been used as a garnish along with flowers. Roses and clove pinks are often mentioned as being used as ornaments for the table and would have been in season in August. The bill has a mention of more flowers and paper and pack thread for a fairly modest outlay of 2 shillings and 6pence. These may have been used as decoration on the linen tablecloths. The bills for other August feasts make mention of the services of a herb woman for considerably larger sums, such as £1 10 shillings. This would suggest that the woman brought herbs in bulk, not just as seasoning for the venison and pies, but to strew the hall. When Ruth pointed this reference out to me, I was very interested, because it is not clear when people ceased strewing the floors of houses and other buildings. Pepys mentions in his diary how after the Great Fire the theatres stopped doing so. He also tells us that he was given an exotic grass mat from Africa for his bedroom, and the cries of London of this date show men selling straw matting for domestic use. However, institutions such as the Stationers' Company may have strewn herbs for special occasions. References in the company archives specify bay, rosemary and laurel. These herbs would have been mixed with rushes or bents that were brought up the Thames on barges and offloaded at the riverside wharves. The herbs, when trodden on, would emit fresh fragrance. Other herbs used in strewing were artemisia or wormwood to deter fleas, and mint, which was disliked by mice. Lavender, which would have been available in August, would provide both a powerful sweet smell and a pretty effect in contrast to the green of the other plants. The drinks to accompany these dishes were beer or wine. Appalling as it may strike purists today, sugar was added to both of these. Pepys records drinking sugared beer in his diary, along with sack, a white wine from Spain, to which he added raspberry syrup. Sack was also Sir John Falstaff's favourite tipple, according to Shakespeare. It was so much a matter of course that he was known as Sir John Sack and Sugar. The one drink that would not have been consumed was water, which was known to carry diseases. Even small children would be given small beer. During the stationers' feasts, toasts were drunk, including the ceremony of the loving cup. Here is one of the company's silver cups, dating from the reign of Charles II. The ceremony is said to date back to Anglo-Saxon times, when King Edward the Martyr was stabbed while drinking from a two-handed cup. This gave rise to a ritual of precaution, with the guest about to drink standing up, with his neighbouring guests also standing, one back to back with him and the second facing. The latter removed and held aloft the cover of the cup with his right dagger hand, while the guest drank a toast and wiped the rim of the cup with a napkin provided. The cover was replaced by the holder. They exchanged bows, turned about, and the cup passed to the next guest. This ceremony resembles a stately dance, but the records suggest that stateliness may not have been the abiding characteristic of the feasts. The butler's bill for 1692 tells a sorry tale. Losses of linen, glasses, knives, salts, spoons, pitchers and jugs. He notes, for my own attendance and hazards of plate, that he charged 10 shillings, with 6 men to assist him for 15 shillings. The court book for 1695 forbade victuals to be carried out of the hall until the end of the meal, suggesting that doggy bags were a common custom among diners. Music was not only played at the celebration for St. Cecilia, but was played at all feasts. And musicians were also part of the great annual celebration, the Lord Mayor's Show. This took place on the 9th of November, and not through the streets of London, but on the River Thames. The livery companies accompanied the new mayor, and the stationers hired a barge until they had their own by 1680. At a time when even the principal streets could become congested, the river was the main thoroughfare for grand occasions. This engraving shows company barges accompanying Charles II and his new queen, Catherine of Braganza, on their way to Whitehall. The barges here belong to the Great 12 companies, but they give an idea of what the stationer's barge looked like. It was a boat in wherry style, shallow, constructed in oak with deal panelling, rowed by 18 oarsmen. As you can see in the picture, they were originally open with a canopy. The company employed a full-time barge master who would stand in the bows of the barge to ensure the way was safe, while his mate was at the stern steering. Under the control of the barge master were also 2 rowing boats, known as whifflers, equipped with 2 or 4 oars and staves for manoeuvring the barge and warning off oncoming boats and potential collisions. The barge master was also responsible for the barge house, which in the case of the stationers was located in Lambeth. A bill dating from late October 1683 shows the preparations being made for the Lord Mayor's Show. The barge was to be made clean and well trimmed, and the house given a new base and mud and dust removed. As with the hall, the barge was strewn with herbs, rosemary, bay and laurel. One bill mentions nosegays for the barge master, mate and 18 oarsmen. There are also bills associated with the livery of the barge master and his men. This from 1681 is for the blue fabric to make his coat and for coats and caps of his steersmen. To denote his status, the barge master wore a badge like this silver one for ceremonial occasions. And music was a vital ingredient to entertain those on board. The kind of instruments is not specified in the accounts, but at the end of the 18th century there are records of French horns, kettle drums, clarinets and bassoons. The sound would of course have carried across the water to the crowds massed on the river banks and wharves. The scene, as captured here by Canaletto, makes it look almost like Venice, but with St. Paul's Cathedral in the background.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret. That was absolutely fascinating. You will see, members attending, that if you go both to chat and to question and answers, you're quite a lively lot, because comments are coming in. I'm delighted to be properly corrected by Past Master Helen Esmond about Caxton. And there are other comments about dates and times of the Lord Mayor's procession, and how much was on streets and how much was on the river. Margaret, I wonder if you would like to answer Robin Meyer's question about, by coffin, does it really mean a coffin or a coffer or box of some sort?
It means actually means a pastry case. So it looks like a coffin. So, but it's a pastry case. So that's why they call them coffins. Right. And just like a pie is today, just like a pie would be have the top, but they would also make it, probably have it completely of pastry.
And completely enclosed?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Okay. Can I ask you a question? Because I'm sort of curious about the nuts and bolts, as it were, of how well the hall was equipped for feasting, how much it had its own catering facilities and so on with staff, and how it arranged supplies, and the extent to which it outsourced some of that activities. I mean, hiring of linen and glasses, etc.
Well, they definitely had their own kitchens. When the stationers moved into Abergavenny House, of course, that was a private house, so it would have had a kitchens with a great chimney for where they could roast the venison on spits, and baking ovens for bread and pastries. Pastry was an incredibly important thing for the ingredient for company feasts. And there's a rather, at one stage in the proceedings, books used to be burnt publicly in the churchyard, and then it was observed that actually if they continued burning them in public, it would be intriguing, and so it was much better to burn them in the company's baking ovens in the hall. So I think that there definitely would have been certainly Abergavenny House before the Great Fire, but also I think I'm sure there were kitchens down below after,
it's a mixed economy, effectively.
Yes, and then of course they would have brought in the plates. They would have had specially hired plates, which is why the butler was getting really cheesed off about having so much of his sorry, I'm being put off by seeing the questions. So he would have, they would have brought in a lot of stuff, especially for the feasts.
And would have to pay for the damage and all of that.
Yes,
so
indeed.
Could you comment on the master's question about eating humble pie?
Yes, well, that was interesting, because the umbles were the heart, liver, and entrails of the deer, and they were the perks of the huntsman during the Middle Ages. And so it would have been, it's a sort of idea of status, I suppose. It would be, you would say almost it's above and below the salt. That's how it started.
Right.
But clearly, by the 17th century, the dishes were, it wasn't regarded as a sort of, it was quite luxurious.
Right. And can you recommend a good 17th century cookbook to Jerome Fagan?
Oh, right. Heavens. Well, Sir Kellam Digby.
Have you thought of writing one yourself?
I've written quite a lot about the 17th century cookery books in the book that's just been published, my book that's just been published, The Domestic Herbal. And so I quoted quite a lot of recipes from Sir Kellam Digby. He had a lot of fascinating recipes. The one who was probably the most best known of the time was Robert May, who claimed that he was he had been the cook for the king. And then a lot of women had their own recipe books in manuscript. It's a very rich time. At one stage, John Beale wrote to somebody saying that the stationers were astir with cookery books.
Well, no, it's too unfair a question to put to you about whether we'll go back to the loving cup when we may not infect each other with COVID-19. But do you have a very quick comment on how this sort of thing recovered after earlier plagues?
That's very interesting. No, I don't really. I suppose they just kind of shut up hall for a bit and then just carried on?
Yeah, which is what
That's an interesting question.
Yes, right. Well, let us move on then. Our final speaker tonight is our archivist, Dr. Ruth Frendo. She's built on the stalwart work over many decades of honorary archivist and liveryman Robin Myers. There's a common misconception that the role of archivist librarians is essentially a passive one. They list the books, they store them, and then they bring them up at the command of the researcher, a job that should be finite and limited. Nothing can be further from the truth. An archive is ever evolving, ever capable of revealing new information and insight. This means that the archivist has not only to know the archive inside out, but must also be intellectually active in understanding when, where, and how new research interests arise, and indeed to be part of stimulating and directing new inquiries and forming fields of study. A lively and creative role in itself. Ruth is performing this task for the company's archive with great aplomb. Ruth.
I decided to take the title of today's programme literally and look at one day in the life of the Stationers' Company. I chose August the 10th, the date of this dinner bill in Margaret's presentation. I'm going to look at three very different records dated the 10th of August, from the years 1579, 1667 and 1737. As archives are all about context and interconnectedness, each of these records will act as a starting point for an exploration of some of the other records held in the Stationers' Company archive. In this way, I hope to give you an idea of how you can use archival records in your own research. My first record is this entry from Liber B, dated 10th of August 1579. Liber B is a remarkable volume which contains court minutes, apprenticeship records, entries of copy, accounts, and licensing decisions. This particular record tells us that on the 10th of August 1579, a young man called Richard Field started a 7-year apprenticeship with the stationer George Bishop. Field was a native of Stratford-upon-Avon and the son of Henry Field, a tanner. There is a further note in the entry pointing out that the first 6 years of the apprenticeship are actually to be served with one Thomas Futurolier to learn the art of printing. It's worth looking more closely at this record, as it tells us a lot about the printing profession at the time. Futurolier was a Huguenot, a refugee from religious persecution in France. He was also an exceptionally talented printer. Through his continental connections, he brought technical sophistication to the London print trade and introduced new subject matter to the English reading public, printing translations of a variety of French texts. Despite Futurolier's high standing among London's printers, however, he could not become a full member of the Stationers' Company, as he was not a native Londoner. Instead, his association with the company was as a brother, as Karen explained for us earlier. If we look up the Wardens' account for this period in Register A, we can find a record of the subscription he paid to the Brotherhood. Hence the somewhat circuitous way in which this apprenticeship is authorised and recorded. Under Futurolier's tuition, Field became an excellent printer and took over his master's niche of foreign language publishing, as we can see from entries of copies such as this one from Liber B. Field is remembered today as the printer of Shakespeare's first published work, the long poem Venus and Adonis. It's possible that Shakespeare and Field knew each other in Stratford-upon-Avon, or simply bonded over their shared experience of making what was then a considerable journey to a new life in London. Let's turn now to another significant document, published on the 10th of August, this one from 1667, the Inspeximus of the English Stock Patent. An inspeximus is an official document testifying that the current monarch has inspected and confirmed a previously granted charter. The Inspectmas of the English Stock Patent testifies to the establishment in 1603, under letters patent granted by James I, of the English Stock, a joint stock company run from Stationers' Hall and publishing a range of popular educational and religious works and almanacs. Over time, shares in the English stock became extremely lucrative, and the enterprise made the Stationers' Company wealthy. One of the avowed purposes of the English stock, however, was the care of the company's poor. This inscription, from the flyleaf of the Stationers' Company Poor Book, reads, "The Book of Accounts of Moneys received yearly of the stock of the privileges, containing also an account of the distribution and bestowings of the same, according to the ordinances in that behalf." This poor book is an invaluable document, providing a record of the widows and orphans otherwise forgotten by history. It also gives us an insight into the changes of fortune experienced by stationers in this period. This entry from 1645, for instance, records the commencement of pension payments to Robert Barker. This was a considerable fall from grace for Barker, who was named as King's printer in James's original letters patent of the English stock. And if you look here at the 1667 Inspectmas, you can see the reference to Barker's name. Barker had got into debt during his involvement in the printing of James's authorised version of the Bible in 1611, and financially he never recovered. To make things worse, in 1631 his imprint was responsible for the scandalous publication which became known as the Wicked Bible, as it omitted the crucial word "not" from the seventh commandment, apparently ordering the faithful to commit adultery. The fine this incurred ruined Barker, and he died in debtor's prison. English stock records are a rich resource for studying the history of printing. This ledger of books in the Treasurer's warehouse, for instance, contains rare records of wholesale prices and indications of print runs in the 17th century, while dividend books from the same period provide useful information about the relative wealth and status of different stationers. The publication of the Inspectmas document in 1667 is evidence of a crucial negotiation of power between the newly restored monarchy and the Corporation of London. Charles II was justifiably suspicious of London's former parliamentarian leanings and enforced successive measures to curb the power of the city and the livery companies. Stationers' Company court records show how the company operated under this pressure. The Stationers' Company Court Book for 26th of March 1661 records that, in some late discourse with Master Secretary Nicholas, Master Secretary advised that the company do renew their charter. This advice of Secretary of State Sir Edward Nicholas was well judged, and in 1664 the court book has this record decreeing that application may be made by Dr. Bailey to entreat him to move the Lord Chancellor about the quo warranto brought by Master Attorney General against the charter of this company. Our final record comes from a volume of 18th century Wardens' accounts. This record is from the 10th of August in 1737, and it gives an interesting glimpse of the practical aspects of owning and managing a property in 18th century London. Scavengers kept the streets clean, and parishes levied rates on their householders to support this work. 18th century London was a burgeoning metropolis, and saw the emergence of many of the phenomena that would come to characterise modern urban life. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and intermittent economic depressions created widespread destitution, and both parish institutions and charitable organisations played a crucial role in addressing this. An earlier entry on this page of the accounts shows the company's payment of the parish poor rate. The lives of the poor worsened considerably during the late 1730s, which saw a period of sustained bad weather. As the temperatures fell, prices of wheat rose, and so did admissions to the workhouses. This culminated in the hard winter of 1739, when the Thames froze over from Christmas Eve 1739 to early March of 1740. Though this provided the occasion for another frost fair, as depicted in this etching from the British Museum, the reality for many poor Londoners was somewhat harsher, and we can see this from the Stationers' Company records. On the 19th of February 1740, a special meeting of the Stationers' Court was convened, to take into consideration the necessities of the poor of this company, occasioned by the extraordinary severity of the season. The court record continues, "It is unanimously agreed and ordered that the sum of £100 be distributed to and amongst the poor of this company, and that £50 part thereof be paid by the corporation out of the money received for the use of the hall for drawing the bridge lottery, and that the remaining £50 be paid by Mr. Simpson out of the English stock of this company." This reference to money received for letting out the hall reminds us that the stationers have used their property to generate revenue for some time. We have records of individual chambers in the stationers' second hall at Peter's College being rented out on long leases, and of similar ranges at Abergavenny House, the site of the stationers' third hall, before the fire of London 1666. After the hall was rebuilt following that fire, we have more detailed records of how much the company charged to let the hall out for funerals, meetings, and special occasions, such as the riotous celebrations of St. Cecilia's feast. By the 18th century, there was quite a busy schedule of commercial lettings of the hall. In 1711, the company clearly saw a need to regulate these arrangements more closely, and the court ordered that the hall should not be let for any county feast without the leave of this court. The hiring of the hall in 1737 by the commissioners of the bridge lottery was an extremely lucrative contract, and in 1739 the court appointed a special committee to manage the negotiations for subsequent hosting of the draw. The lottery was a government scheme to raise money to build a new bridge at Westminster. English state lotteries began as early as the 1690s, and money raised by this method was used to fund everything from charitable schemes to military campaigns. The 18th century saw a significant rise in the popularity of lotteries. As full tickets were expensive, it was common for people to buy shares in a ticket. Records in our archive, such as this lottery ticket from 1792, show that 18th century stationers were not averse to the occasional gamble. Thank you for joining me on this brief tour of the records of the Stationers' Company. I hope you feel inspired to make your own investigations of our records. You can access them online via the Adam Matthew digital resource. Our website also offers useful information on related online resources, which are free to access. And once we can reopen our doors, we're looking forward to welcoming you to our reading room.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. I think you'll all agree that our speakers this evening have served us very well. They've certainly demonstrate the depth and richness of the company's archive, and the fact that it's rightly seen as a vitally important cultural asset. Another interesting example of this occurs to me, Paul Wilson's new book, Pilgrim's Profit and Print, which is about how stationers were very specifically involved in the political, social and economic movements that fed the explorations and settlement of North America in the 17th century. And Paul is to lecture for us on that on the 22nd of September. So the archive is something stationers can be rightly proud of, and the company works hard to conserve, develop and make it accessible, recognizing the contribution it makes to the social and educational purposes of the organization. We still have some questions to answer. You have been very lively attendees, because if you look at both chat and at questions and answers, you will see comments have come flowing in, supplementing what the speakers have said, sometimes suggesting some corrections or some developments to specific comments that have been made. I'm very attracted to Nicholas Briley's suggestion that when we're all up and running, we should have a massive celebratory feast that will be based on historical dishes from the stationers past, including humble pie and other sort of pasties. And it's fascinating that the general stench from the kitchens and the cooking is one that runs through the history of the company, as Robin's comment has made. And I was intrigued to discover at a sort of cursory examination that since the 17th century, the company has been at war with the canons of St. Paul's Cathedral about certain windows that overlook certain residences in the canonry. And that may or may not, I guess, be put right in the massive development of the hall, which is proposed for the coming year. Ruth, are you in a good position to answer Jerome Fagan's question about the extent to which the company had a better hold or not on copyright during the Protectorate? If anybody ever had a control, a proper handle on copyright at any period.
I always feel quite nervous about using the term copyright when you're talking about this period, because it meant something substantially different from what we would consider intellectual property. In terms of the registers being a more accurate reflection of what was actually printed, the answer is no. And I don't really know why there is this discrepancy, but we do know an awful lot more was printed than was ever recorded in the registers, including material that was printed by quite prominent stationers. So that's something I'm encouraging all of you historians out there to come and research and explain to me.
Right. And I see that Jerome hopes that if we do have a grand feast with 17th century dishes, there won't be any lamprey on it.
Indeed, I can guarantee, having discovered about lampreys, I think that's the one thing I would not wish to.
What are lamprey?
They're like eels, except that they're invertebrates, and they have suckers and suck along the mud on the bottom of rivers, and they did for Henry I. It's famously he died of a surfeit of lampreys.
Okay.
And the Galicians are particular, in Spain, that's where they still cook lampreys. Yeah.
Well, I think that if we had been in the hall, it's at this point that I would have been receiving frantic semaphore signals from Giles Fagan at the back to announce that the buffet was ready to be served, and so we should move towards sort of closing our session, which has proved very stimulating and very lively. And I'm delighted that so many of you who have come to listen to the talks have made such interesting comments on both the chat and on the question and answers facility that this fantastic technology allows us to have. I'm now handing over to Sarah Maherta, who manages the Archive and Special Collections Centre at the University of Art London. Sarah project managed on behalf of the company the work to create and move into the Tocquefield Centre, a truly modern purpose-built storage and study place made possible by generous benefactions and located within the oldest surviving warehouse in the City of London. You have everything good about the company in that sentence. Sarah chairs the Library and Archives Committee that works with the Hall and Heritage Committee and the Court to make vibrant the whole cultural side of the company's life. Sarah.
Thank you, Gordon. So it is my great pleasure to thank all of our panellists for contributing to our first virtual archive evening, as the Master kindly mentioned in his introduction. I'm sure you would all like me to thank Dr. Karen Waring, Margaret Wills and Dr. Ruth Frendo for their thorough and fascinating presentations on the life of members of the Stationers' Company. Elegantly chaired by Dr. Gordon Johnson and supported by your questions, I hope that you agree that this has been almost as rewarding as meeting together in the hall. I'm pleased to note that liverymen are much better behaved in the 21st century than some of them were in the 17th century. So thank you all for participating and have a very good evening. Bye-bye.